Right now, a record-challenging heat dome is settling over the American West, delivering the hottest temperatures of the entire summer so far to a region that was already dealing with dozens of large, uncontained wildfires before this heat wave even arrived on the scene. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, close to 40,000 fires have already torn through more than 3.6 million acres across the United States. So far this year, including 500,000 acres burned in just the last 2 weeks alone, a genuinely staggering pace for this point in the season. That's roughly 10,000 more fires and nearly 1 million more acres than the 10-year average for this exact point in the season, a gap significant enough to catch the attention of fire officials across every affected state. And the agency's own language on this is blunt. Fire activity is already mirroring conditions normally not seen until later in the fire season, a warning sign worth taking seriously, given how much of the traditional fire season calendar still remains. Today, we're going to break down exactly what's driving this crisis. We're also going to break down why this specific combination of drought, snowpack, and heat has created what one climatologist called a perfect storm. And we're going to break down what this newly arriving heat dome means for a fire season that's already running dramatically ahead of schedule this year. If you want to stay on top of this as it develops throughout the coming days, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we track breaking wildfire and weather activity constantly. Let's get into it. Let's start with what's happening in the atmosphere right now, because it's the direct driver of everything else in this story. A high-pressure ridge is settling over the American West right now. Forecasters are describing it as challenging seasonal heat records, delivering the summer's hottest temperatures, yet to a region already under significant strain from months of accumulated dryness. Overnight, low temperatures across the West are expected to remain nearly 10 degrees above normal throughout this entire event. That detail matters enormously, since it's precisely the kind of no-recovery window pattern we've discussed before on this channel. When nighttime temperatures don't drop enough to give the body and the landscape a genuine chance to cool down before the next day's heat builds again, both human health risk and fire danger compound rapidly rather than resetting overnight. Heat remains the single deadliest type of extreme weather in the United States, with a higher annual average death toll than tornadoes, hurricanes, and lightning combined, according to National Weather Service statistics. Emergency room visits for heat-related illness reliably surge on days classified as major or extreme risk. This heat dome is expected to push much of the region into exactly that dangerous category over the coming days ahead. Beyond the direct human health risk, this heat wave is specifically worsening wildfire conditions that were already severe before it arrived. The mechanism is one we've explained in detail on this channel before. Intense, sustained heat pulls moisture out of soil and vegetation at an accelerated rate, drying out the landscape faster than any reasonable rainfall could replace it. This heat dome will dry out already parched ground even further, making the region more vulnerable to new ignitions and more rapid fire spread across areas that are already critically primed to burn. This heat is also compounding a separate related crisis across the region's water supply. Much of the Colorado River Basin, along with higher elevations in central and southern California, saw below-average snowfall this past winter. The combined water level of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, two of the largest reservoirs in the entire United States, is currently sitting at a historic low and continuing to drop. These reservoirs, together with the broader river basin, supply water to tens of millions of people across the Southwest. This heat wave will only accelerate evaporation and further deplete water levels that were already at their lowest point on record. That adds a third interconnected layer of strain: extreme heat, extreme fire danger, and a deepening water crisis, all playing out simultaneously across the same region. This water dimension carries its own separate, longer-term consequences worth understanding, beyond the immediate fire and heat emergency. Both Lake Mead and Lake Powell serve critical functions well beyond simple water storage, including hydroelectric power generation that supplies electricity to millions of homes and businesses across multiple states. As reservoir levels continue dropping toward historic lows, the physical infrastructure generating that power becomes less efficient. In the most severe scenarios, portions of that generating capacity can become entirely inoperable if water levels fall below the intake points the turbines depend on. That risk adds yet another layer of strain precisely during the stretch of summer when electricity demand for air conditioning is at its annual peak, a genuinely difficult convergence of infrastructure vulnerability, arriving at exactly the moment regional power grids can least afford it. As of the most recent tracking, the U.S. National Interagency Fire Center has reported dozens of large, uncontained wildfires actively burning across the country, concentrated heavily in California, Washington, Oregon, and other western states. Numerous fires in the Northwest specifically are displaying what officials describe as extreme fire behavior. More than 21,000 wildland firefighters are currently working to contain these blazes nationwide, a genuinely massive mobilization of personnel reflecting the scale of what's currently burning. Colorado and Utah have been hit particularly hard this season. At the end of June, 3 firefighters died and 2 more were injured battling the Knowles fire along the shared border of the 2 states, a tragic reminder of the real human cost behind the statistics this video has been describing. Of the large wildfires burning nationwide, a disproportionate share have been concentrated in these 2 states specifically. In California, the Elephant Fire in Sierra County has burned over 13,000 acres. Fire weather risk has been elevated across parts of Central California, Oregon, and Nevada, as hot, dry winds continue to fan existing blazes and create conditions favorable for new ignitions. Here's the part of this story that deserves real attention, because officials and researchers studying this crisis haven't described it as some unpredictable freak occurrence. John Meyer, Utah's assistant state climatologist, described the situation directly, from a landscape point of view, from a fuels point of view, and from a weather and climate point of view. Everything converged simultaneously to produce what he called the perfect storm of conditions for one of the region's worst wildfire seasons in a decade. That convergence had been building for months before this heat dome ever arrived. Many western states saw record or near record low snowpack over the winter, coinciding with consistently high winter temperatures. That was capped off by a heat wave as early as March that melted much of what little snow reserve had accumulated. That early aggressive snowmelt set the stage for an unusually early and intense start to fire season, months before this current heat dome added its own additional layer of dried out vegetation on top of ground that was already critically compromised. Nick Nosler of the National Weather Service's Storm Prediction Center put it plainly, the intensity of this fire season isn't entirely surprising, given the conditions that preceded it. This pattern isn't just something officials have observed anecdotally this season, it's been quantified in recent peer-reviewed research. A study examining wildfire data across the West from 2001 through 2024 found that nearly half of the total area burned by fires during that entire period occurred during or immediately after a heat wave. That's a striking statistic that directly connects this year's repeated heat events to the scale of acreage now burning. The same research found that the area scorched by fires each day increases measurably during active heatwave periods compared to fires burning under more moderate conditions. This means heat waves don't just create more opportunities for ignition. They make every individual fire that does start meaningfully more destructive while that heat wave is underway. This research connects directly to something else researchers have documented about the timing of Western wildfire activity. Analysis of wildfire data from 2000 through 2019 found that nearly twice as many wildfires are recorded on July 4th as on almost any other single day of the year in the U.S. West. That's a pattern driven by the combination of fireworks use and the specific climatological conditions that make early to midsummer so consistently dangerous across this region. Researchers studying this trend have been direct that this risk is likely to keep worsening as climate change continues drying out the broader region, extending the window of critical fire danger earlier into the season and intensifying it once it arrives. The scale of this crisis has triggered exactly the kind of cross-border mutual aid response we've documented in other major wildfire and weather disasters covered on this channel. The National Interagency Fire Center confirmed that crews from Australia and New Zealand are now supporting wildfire response efforts, specifically in the northwestern United States. That's a genuinely significant international deployment, reflecting how severe conditions have become in that specific region. This kind of long-distance firefighting support isn't offered lightly. It requires both a formal request from the receiving country acknowledging that domestic resources are stretched thin, and a genuine willingness from allied nations to commit their own trained personnel and equipment to a wildfire crisis happening on the opposite side of the planet. That underscores just how seriously the season's Northwest fire activity is being taken at an international level. This kind of arrangement isn't new. It actually runs in both directions, depending on which hemisphere is experiencing its own fire season at a given time. American wildland firefighters have deployed to support Australian bushfire response during that country's summer fire seasons in past years, just as Australian and New Zealand crews are now supporting the U.S. effort during the Northern Hemisphere's peak fire season. That reciprocal arrangement reflects a broader, increasingly important reality of global wildfire management. As fire seasons intensify simultaneously across multiple continents due to the same underlying warming trends, no single country's firefighting workforce, however well-resourced, can realistically maintain enough surplus capacity to handle its own worst-case fire season without occasionally calling on international partners who happen to be between their own fire seasons at that specific moment. To understand just how far ahead of schedule this fire season is running, it helps to compare it against previous, notably bad Western fire seasons. This region has faced serious wildfire crises before, and the comparison illustrates whether this year genuinely represents an escalation or simply another difficult but familiar summer. Previous severe western fire seasons have seen more than 60 active large blazes burning simultaneously across the West and Alaska during their worst stretches, with hundreds of thousands of hectares destroyed along the west coast alone. Those outcomes were, at the time, described as potentially outpacing the worst fire season on record. That comparison point is worth holding on to, because this year's numbers, close to 40,000 individual fires and 3.6 million acres burned nationally, are already running roughly 10,000 fires, and nearly 1 million acres ahead of the 10-year average for the same point in the calendar. That's a genuinely significant escalation rather than a marginal one. What makes direct year-to-year comparisons especially difficult in wildfire reporting is that total acreage burned depends heavily on exactly which fires happen to occur in dense forest versus open grassland, and how quickly individual large fires get contained versus allowed to burn across remote terrain with fewer values at risk. That's part of why NIFC's own framing, that current activity is mirroring conditions normally not seen until later in the season, carries more diagnostic weight than a simple acreage comparison against any single prior year. It's not just saying this season is bad in absolute terms. It's saying the timing itself is unusual, with fire behavior typical of August or September showing up, while much of the traditional fire season calendar still lies ahead. That's a detail that matters enormously for how much worse this season could still become before it's over. It's worth explaining specifically why the combination of extreme heat and heavy wildfire smoke, both present across the West simultaneously right now, poses a meaningfully greater danger than either hazard would on its own, since this compounding effect doesn't always get explained clearly in day-to-day coverage. Extreme heat itself places direct strain on the cardiovascular system, forcing the heart to work harder as the body attempts to dissipate excess heat through increased blood flow to the skin and through sweating. Wildfire smoke, meanwhile, introduces fine particulate matter deep into the lungs and bloodstream, triggering inflammation and additional cardiovascular strain of its own. When both hazards hit a population simultaneously, as is currently happening across parts of the fire-affected West, the physiological strain doesn't simply add together, it compounds, since a body already working overtime to manage heat stress has less capacity to also manage the added burden of smoke-related inflammation and reduced oxygen efficiency. This compounding risk falls hardest on specific groups: older adults whose cardiovascular systems are generally less able to compensate for combined stressors. It also falls hardest on anyone with existing heart or lung conditions. It also falls hardest on outdoor workers who can't simply retreat indoors during the worst hours of heat and smoke exposure. And falls hardest on children, whose developing respiratory systems and higher relative air intake make them particularly vulnerable to smoke exposure, even when temperatures aren't simultaneously extreme. Public health officials in regions facing this exact combination typically recommend staying indoors with air conditioning and a properly rated air filter running whenever both a heat advisory and a smoke advisory are active at the same time, rather than treating either hazard as manageable in isolation, precisely because the combined physiological toll is measurably worse than either exposure would be on its own. Given everything driving this crisis, the practical outlook for the remainder of the season is genuinely concerning. NIFC's own assessment that current fire activity is mirroring conditions normally not expected until later in the season implies exactly what it sounds like. The traditional peak of western fire danger, typically arriving later in summer, is instead showing up early, while a substantial portion of the historically riskiest stretch of the calendar still lies ahead. Combined with a newly arriving, record-challenging heat dome actively drying out already parched vegetation across the region, there's a real possibility this season continues escalating rather than leveling off in the weeks immediately ahead. For residents across the affected western states, the practical guidance mirrors what we've emphasized throughout previous wildfire coverage on this channel. Know your specific evacuation zone and route if you live in a fire-prone area. Don't wait for an official evacuation order to start preparing, since conditions this dry and this hot can allow a fire to spread with very little advance warning. Keep a go-bag ready with essential documents, medications, and basic supplies, packed and accessible rather than something you plan to assemble once an evacuation order actually arrives, since that assembly process itself can cost precious minutes during a fast-moving evacuation. Monitor local air quality alerts closely given how many large fires are currently active simultaneously across the region. Take extreme heat warnings seriously in their own right, independent of fire risk, given that heat itself remains the most lethal weather hazard the country faces in a typical year. If you're in an area under red flag warning or elevated fire weather risk, avoid any activity that could produce a spark, since a huge share of this year's ignitions, like so many previous fire seasons, will ultimately trace back to preventable human causes rather than natural triggers like lightning. Close to 40,000 fires, more than 3.6 million acres burned, dozens of large uncontained blazes actively displaying extreme fire behavior across multiple western states, 3 firefighters already dead, International crews now deployed from Australia and New Zealand to help manage a crisis significant enough to require that level of cross-border support. And now, layered directly on top of all of it, a record-challenging heat dome delivering the summer's hottest temperatures yet, with almost no overnight relief, to ground that researchers have directly linked to nearly half of all Western wildfire acreage, burning during or immediately after exactly this kind of heat event. This is not a disaster that arrived without warning. Record-low snowpack, an unusually early spring heat wave, and a summer of repeated, intensifying heat domes converged in precisely the way climatologists studying this region predicted they would. The result is a fire season that, by the government's own admission, is behaving like it's already deeper into summer than the calendar actually shows. That predictability doesn't make the crisis any less serious for the communities currently living through it. But it does carry an important implication for how this story should be understood going forward. This isn't a mysterious, unprecedented anomaly that caught officials off guard. It's the direct, foreseeable outcome of a specific set of conditions that researchers and climatologists were actively warning about months before this heat dome ever arrived. That is precisely why continued monitoring and early preparedness matter so much for whatever the remainder of this fire season still has in store. We'll keep tracking this crisis closely as new fire activity, containment updates, and weather data come in over the days ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it. Drop a comment and tell me if you're anywhere in the affected region. Or tell me if wildfire smoke has reached where you live this summer, and tell me whether this heat dome has hit your area yet. I read every one of these. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.